Okay, I've just powered on the ASRock motherboard and you get this screen. However, it very briefly shows and says to hit F2. But because there's an added RAID adapter on my ASRock Z68 motherboard, that BIOS comes up next. So we need to wait for this to finish and then hit F2 on the keyboard to get in to the ASRock motherboard's BIOS setup utility. Okay, we're in. Next, I don't really like this guy's face looking at me. Neither did other people apparently, so ASRock, put in the second option. That's the logo we're going to want. Next, let's set the clock before we forget. So if we're going to install an operating system, we might as well have our clock correct right up front. That is the date, fix the time. Okay, now the clock is set. A couple things to point out. You'll see the BIOS level I'm at. I'll point it out with the mouse. P 130. So I'm on BIOS 130. All right. Let's move along to some of the other settings. Because of the way I'm recording video, I'm going to skip the mouse and go largely with keyboard here. So I hit right arrow, bring up the screen. So on this screen, I'm bringing up sort of my known good settings in another window where I had everything working. And I'll make sure I set all my screens exactly right. So this screen is fine at factory defaults for everything. But because of the RAM I have in here, I want to make sure my settings are correct. And I found the auto detect doesn't always seem to work right. Notice it's saying profile 88824, yet it's putting in values of 99924. So that's what I want to go ahead and fix here. So auto doesn't work for some brands of memory, is what I'm finding in my experience. And it's necessary for me to go ahead and to change the 3 9s to 8s. Which looks like this. So we turn off auto, put it on manual, and type in 8. Down arrow, auto, change to manual, type in 8. Down arrow, whoops, change to manual, down arrow, type in 8. Okay, so we're done with that screen. If we hit escape and then enter to go back in, you'll see all the settings are still there. Now, frequency. It's on auto, but it's saying 1333. But at the top you'll see with auto detected that it should be able to do 1600. So again, this is a memory in there that's actually not on the list that ASRock tested. So it's not really a surprise. I have some manual work to do here. So the next thing is to turn this to the proper memory speed. Excellent. I've tested this for months. These settings work great with this memory. Stable, no problem. All right, next, hit escape from this screen. And let me just hit down arrow to voltage control. Everything's left at auto, and that will be fine according to my notes here. Okay, we can make profiles, but this thing's just going to be running ESX, and I'm not really going to fiddle with the settings, so I'm not going to bother with setting up profiles. I hit right arrow to go into advanced, CPU configuration. This is also important. Well, pretty much every screen here is going to be important. Let me bring that up. Okay, hyper-threading enabled. Let me just quickly eyeball all those other settings. No execute memory protection. I've been turning that on. Let me show you the description. Down arrow, and now it wraps around to the top of the list again. Okay, next. Northbridge. VTD is disabled by default. We're going to want that on. That's for pass-through of USB, the added USB card, for instance. Next, primary graphics. On board in my case. It's not added. I don't need it to auto-sniff, or if I add an adapter, I don't want video coming out of it. I might actually do that for pass-through reasons, but again, I want onboard cheap, slower, more memory efficient video. I don't want to add a PCI adapter for more watt burn at the moment, just to run ESX. Render standby I've been turning off. Again, I'm not gaming or doing anything. This is a server. You can read the description on the right. I'm not doing multiple monitors. And memory. For whatever reason, I put this on a small number. It hasn't seemed to hurt anything. The ASUS manual is pretty good. Excuse me, ASRock manual is pretty good here, where you can go ahead and read in the help system all about what these different settings are. Let's move on to the next screen. Southbridge. In my case, I have a remote power on device. I actually like the machine to turn right back on when power is restored. So in my case, I'm going to do that. You need to think about that a little bit. If you have a house where you don't have batteries or you don't want the machine coming on when power is restored, you could turn that off. So just kind of think about how do you want this machine to behave when you first plug it into the wall after a power outage or a storm or whatever. Do you want the machine to automatically turn on, or do you want to have to push the power switch yourself? Okay, LAN, I want both of the onboards on. I do not need FireWire. I don't need audio. Leave that alone. This is about the power LED and the onboard LEDs. They're in auto. Let me just show you the options. Off, on, auto. So it shows for a while and then goes to sleep is how I recall it behaving when I looked at it when I was near the machine. Okay, next screen. Storage. Here we got a lot of changes to make. We want to go into ASCi mode. We want to say yes for bootable because I've got my DVD-ROM plugged in to the eSATA port on the back of the planer. Does that make any sense? The back port where you hook up all your mouse and keyboard, I have a internal SATA to external SATA cable running all the way from my DVD-ROM drive through a CPU cooling hole in the back of my case, right out the back. So that way I don't take up a valuable SATA 3 port on the motherboard, for instance, that I'd rather use for hard drives. Okay, SATA mode here, I want AHCI. RAID would not be supported on ESXi 5.0, so we'll just go with AHCI mode. Leave that on. I want to turn on Smart. Not sure why you wouldn't want that on. You'll notice I have a couple of drives hooked up right now. Okay, now when you make a change to the disk mode, we need to reboot before we go setting up boot orders. So it'll sniff out disks in that new mode and give some new options here. So there are a couple other screens on here, and then I'm going to reboot. Super I/O, let's finish that. No need for a floppy controller. I'm not using the serial port. Let me think about that for just a moment. Am I able to pass through just the serial port on the motherboard? I don't think so. I use USB pass-through at this point anyway. I don't really need serial. Next. Oops. So those are all disabled. Hit escape. ACPI parameters. Let's see. I used over there. All those settings are fine as is. And now we go to USB. Oops. I made a little mistake there. I didn't change anything. I just accidentally hit enter there. Okay, so now on USB, I turn on legacy USB 3.0. That way we can actually boot off of a USB key. If it's stuck in a USB 3.0 slot, it'll act like USB 2.0. I believe when I tested it, that's what this did for me, that behavior. Okay, so we've made all those changes, and now to change the boot order and fan speed and all that, let's finish up. So we've done 1, 2, 3, these 3 big icons. Now we're going to reboot and finish the other icons. Right arrow all the way to exit, save changes and exit. Hit enter for yes. So here we are in our second reboot, and the ACPI has been turned on instead of IDE mode. You'll notice the face didn't quite go away yet. I'll explain why that is coming up shortly here. So I'm getting ready to hit that delete key on the keyboard to get into the BIOS again after the RAID adapter is done coming up. And you'll see the LAN adapter and added network adapter also showed its BIOS. Okay, so we're ready to pick up where we were. Let's go back and look at storage. So all our settings obviously stuck. You can see Southbridge, FireWire turned off, for instance, and so is audio. Same thing, Northbridge to BTD turned on. So everything looks good. We're ready to hit right arrow and move to HW monitor. Now we're talking about fan speeds. And here's what I found. I do full on for the CPU water cooler. It really seems to draw very little watts, under 1 I believe, when I looked at the pump, how much it moves, or how much it costs in terms of watts to move water through that radiator. So I just leave the CPU fan 1 and 2 on full on. The fan is the one that's blowing through the radiator. So the CPU I keep quite cool. However, for chassis fan, I put this one in automatic, and it's running rather cool to the touch. Nothing inside my case is a problem. And I'll say my target is 113. Keep it there if possible. This fan speed, I find I can save a couple watts, and everything internally is just fine to the touch, even under full load. Chassis fan 2, I move that down to level 3. Chassis fan 3. There is no automatic mode, so I move that one manually down to level 5. Over temperature protection, it'll shut down if things get hot. I leave it on. Notice the RPMs. You're getting a live look at the RPMs there. Okay. Next, we can now hit right arrow to move to boot order. Okay. I like to kind of start with hard drives. So I go into here and I look. We want to boot from the Lexar. That's my USB stick. And even if I accidentally leave a DVD-ROM drive, I don't want to boot off it. So I like the USB burst. Do I want the RAID and all this other stuff in the boot order? No. Let me just clean all that out. So I'm going to say delete. Now later on, I do have an ESXi attached drive. For instance, Hyper-V in Windows 2008 native. I can go ahead and install that on one of these drives that's attached directly to the motherboard. No problem. And, do a doable config. But to keep things simple, let me focus on ESXi booting right now. And because of that, I'm going to disable everything but the USB key for boot option. Okay, hit escape. Network device, I don't want that on. I'm not booting off the network. I'm not booting over the LAN. TFTP, all that, I'm not using that. So just don't need my boot up to be slowed by that. Notice the DVD-ROM drive shows, so it's a good sign. It sees my brand and type of DVD-ROM slim drive. It's a laptop style. Then slot load, DVD drive. Okay, so now if we look up here, I'm just going to disable. Put the DVD up there. There we go, keeping it simple. USB key first, if there's something bootable on it. Next is ESXi install CD, which I've already stuck in. All right, so boot order is all set. I like to give myself a nice 7 seconds here to choose boot order if I want an alternate. I like to turn off. Oops, my clock set came up. I didn't hit the mouse in the wrong spot. I did not mean to do that. I hit left arrow. Try that again. Right arrow. Okay. Numlock. Turn that off. Legacy RAM. Here we go. Full screen logo. Notice add-on ROM we definitely want. That's my RAID adapter in my case. But we don't need the guy's face showing at boot, so I turn that off. Now notice the legacy device is missing now, but I'm okay with that. Let me just show you the options here. If we put on EFI, it won't work because I don't have an EFI compatible PCI adapter, RAID adapter. There's very few of them at this point. Early 2012. Boot from onboard LAN, no need. Boot failure count, disabled. I don't want 3 times of improper boot for any reason to reset my whole BIOS to factory defaults. That would kind of annoy me. So I disable that. If it doesn't boot for 3 times in a row, I kind of want to know why. I don't want it to just go back to factory defaults and then have to redo everything you just watched in this video. I'm ready to hit right arrow. This is where we could set a supervisor password during initial setup. Not really recommended or advised. I'm going to be doing a lot of rebooting during this initial install. And then finally, save changes and exit. So we're in the final stretch here where I can actually go ahead and reboot. And we're going to kick off the ESX install at this point. So that kind of ends the first chapter of configuring your ASRock motherboard for your ESXi 5.0 install. Next video to watch would be how to actually install ESXi 5.0 update rollup 1. Thank you for watching and for visiting tinkertree.com. This video picks up where the last video left off, and that was I fully configured the ASRock motherboard to reboot off the ESXi 5.0 rollup 1 CD, and now it's time to go ahead and reboot, saving all those changes I made and exiting. So here we go. We are now booting off the ESXi 5.0 rollup 1 boot CD. You can see during the boot all my different SATA devices. There's the DVD-ROM drive. Here comes the RAID adapter, which slowly initializes. And then because there's nothing on the USB key, which is first in the boot order, it should roll right into the second boot device, which is the DVD-ROM drive. So I'm going to hit nothing intentionally here, and let's just see what happens. All right, good. In 6 seconds, it's going to continue. So because it found nothing on the USB key, which is first in the boot order, it rolled over to the second boot device, the DVD-ROM drive. And you saw it just said the update roll up there. Again, I hit nothing on the keyboard and just wait a little bit patiently. And now it's booting the ESXi installer. I'm going to let it go ahead and record the entire install process in real time because it doesn't really take very long. This happens to be a Lexar 8 gig USB stick. 2 gig would be plenty. I just don't have any more of those lying around with a nice blinky LED light in the front. So I'm sticking with this rather small Lexar with a nice big glowing red blinky light right in the front of my ESXi server so I can kind of see when I power on if it's booting from ESXi. I like the blinking light. It only blinks when you power it on. Once ESXi hypervisor is booted, there's very little activity on the USB key. I believe I read somewhere, I don't know, it was once every 20 minutes or something, it might be logging something. So you might get momentary I/O on the USB key, a very small amount of data. But the hypervisor really works just fine off of a plain old commodity USB stick. This is, again, a Z68 motherboard, really a lab environment, not trying to be like production, not trying to be server grade, redundant flash memory or anything expensive. This is just a cheap under $20 USB 2.0 stick. I should point out it won't work in the USB 3.0 slots even in legacy mode. ESXi won't do well because it doesn't recognize 3.0 natively for the hypervisor. So we just keep it simple and go with USB 2.0 for the install here. Notice it found my Core i7 and it's a 2600, not the 2600K, and it's not overclocked. It's at the factory default 3.4 gigahertz. 16 gig of RAM in there currently. I do want to go to 32 gig as soon as possible. So far we've hit absolutely nothing on the keyboard. Until the questions start. Okay, here's our first question. Welcome to the install. Hit enter. License agreement, F11. It's now scanning for install target candidates, and it should find a few. It doesn't know what the BIOS is set for boot order, so it's offering a lot of devices that I don't even have set in the boot order. So again, it doesn't care or know what the BIOS. So I just manually pick my device. I'm not booting off my RAID array. I like to boot off the USB stick. Very simple. We hit F1, it can help us identify a little bit more about that USB stick or key or pen drive, whatever you want to call it. And it's saying it found nothing on there. So that's kind of our way of sneaking a peek if we really inserted a blank USB key in there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter to continue at this point. And there is a partition there with no data, so I'm going to hit enter again. English keyboard in my case. Root password. Try that again. Typed a little fast, I guess. We want to make a note of my root password because I will not be able to get in if I didn't. Although with local console there are ways to deal with that, but anyhow, there's very few questions in the hypervisor install. You'll probably, if this is the first time you're watching an install, you'll probably be surprised how straightforward and how quick it is. Configuring is another matter. Setting the clock, NTP time source, hostname, that comes later. But the actual install itself is very quick and easy. Okay, the installer is configured to install to such and such. That's the USB stick. I'm going to hit F11. And there it goes. I'm going to go ahead and leave it running in real time. We are 6 minutes into the video, and right around 9:31 is when it started. So let's see how many minutes it actually takes to finish. I'll mute the audio now. All right, we're about 4 minutes, or sorry, only 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes in, and there, it just finished laying down all the files. Successfully installed. It will operate in trial mode. Please remove the installed disk before rebooting. Now, the DVD has already been ejected at this point, I believe, but also my USB key is first in the boot order. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit Enter to reboot. And let's see what happens. Here comes the Z68 motherboard BIOS. Here come the devices that the ASMedia ESXi controller sees right there. Western Digital Drive, SATA 2 speed, 1 terabyte. Now it's going to find a DVD-ROM. There you go, another, that's a boot target. Now it's finding the PCI device, the RAID adapter. Which is not a boot target. And now that it's done initializing the RAID array, notice we no longer see the boot screen for the network adapter, so we're no longer wasting our time with that coming up. Oh, I spoke wrong. I just saw it briefly, but it looked maybe like it was shorter. I'm not sure. Okay, and now we should time out and start booting ESXi off the USB key. So we'll get an idea if we're booting off the CD, which is ejected, or the USB key based on just pure speed. I didn't physically run down to look at it, but again, I know how the BIOS was set up, and I do believe this particular instance does actually eject the CD at the end anyway. So this looks good. To be filled by OEM at the top left there is a little awkward. That's just a field that apparently ASRock did not fill in. On Gigabyte and ASUS and MSI, that was filled in, I believe, when I tried those May and June of 2011. Just a little oversight on the part of ASRock. Notice MegaRAID SAS loaded. So that's a new driver that came out in Rollup 1. Just makes it easier. I don't have to add anything. I'll be able to see my RAID array from the very first boot of ESXi. So we're getting near the conclusion here of configuring ESXi on first boot, but I'm going to take a few more moments to kind of look at what adapter it's using for the service console and if everything's good to go before I head over to log in with the client. All right. Now, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to hit F2. I don't like the IP it's picked. And I'm going to hard code it. I don't want it to be DHCP. So here we go. Configure management network. Hit enter. Network adapters. Hit enter. vNIC 0. Sure. I tend to use that. And I'll have to look that up. I believe that's the Realtek. Now that might be the added Intel adapter. I'm not sure. But either way, I kind of find it handy just mentally to remember vMNIC 0 is the first one that VMware discovers. And I don't plan to move network adapters around at all in this system. I've got 4 interfaces. That should be plenty, even if I try iSCSI someday. If we hit D for view details, it gives us a little more information. So that screen we're fine. I hit escape. The screen I really want to get to is not VLAN, it's IP config. Spacebar, tab, kind of an old school interface here. Whoops, let's try that again. Down arrow, down arrow. Okay, gateway, subnet mask, all that's good. Hit enter. IPv6 we can leave alone. Notice it's not enabled by default. Escape. DNS config, I do want to set. So notice it's found true DNS hosts. They're Google. That's what my router fed out to my local network. But I don't really have true DNS where it's going to know this host name, so I'm going to have some host name hacking to do. I like to generically call it ESXi, all lowercase. I don't want to put a 5 or 5.0 in there because it's going to change. I'm going to upgrade it. So I like to just call it ESXi and hit enter. DNS suffixes, just to show you. I don't want the RI.Rhode Island. That's just a suffix that my DHCP server for my ISP served me, Cox. So I hit enter there. Go back in, and it's stuck. Go back in, it's stuck. So all my settings are good now. One other thing though, my ESX host is never looking on the real internet to look up anything. So let me just go ahead and put in my router. I messed that up, sorry. Can't remember if I can put the same one twice. Yeah, that doesn't seem to offend it. Okay, so that's done. Hit escape. It's now going to prompt me. Do I want to apply changes and restart? Absolutely. Great. So we've got a hard-coded IP. We can now do a little test, and we can ping stuff. And success. And we can't resolve a Rhode Island host name. Fine. Interesting, because now that I think about it, ESXi, when it looks for appliances, it will try to do DNS lookups and surf the web. My router should be serving up DNS, but maybe it's not. So let's take a moment to check that out. Let's see if it behaves differently now. Whoops. Interesting that that crept back in too. So I think it's going to insist on a suffix. And it's coming back to me now that I think that's just how it behaves. So now, hit escape, yes, and do another test. Let's see how we do this time. Okay, so the failure is because it's not a real web address, right? It's ESXi, but Cox doesn't know that as a real name. So what we've learned here is that the right way to set this will be like this. We don't need to go to Google for any lookups. Makes no sense. And we want to leave the alternate name server blank. And how do I get it to stop putting that nonsense on there? I might have to do that through the GUI later. Custom domain name suffix. Okay, so here we got comma.local. Use spaces or commas, separate multiple entries. No trailing space, enter. Hit escape, say yes. And now let's look carefully here. Configure again. We're going to go right back in and see how DNS looks. And it looks like it likes to append. So I think what this means is we have to type in this. Wow. Go back, configure. Okay, looks like we've got it. So we've got DNS behaving now. I don't ever have to type local. When I log into the host, the way I'm going to tweak the host files on the vCenter Appliance and on ESXi itself, and then my Windows boxes that attach, I'm just going to tweak the host file for ESXi. And I don't need to type .local ever. So we're all good there. And that means if I hit escape and do a test now, we expect again that I can still ping stuff. And of course, the NS lookup that it's trying to do from Cox is going to fail, and that's just normal for a home lab like this, where your router doesn't usually have the capability of putting true DNS in for non-Windows hosts. So we're done. Let me hit F2 one more time and mention that we can allow SSH from here as well. So in lockdown mode. But again, I don't need to tweak any of that from here. So we've got ESXi working. It's all good. What I like to do at this point, to make absolutely sure the machine comes up and acts normal with its clock and everything else, initialized now that the network is set, is I like to reboot at this point. So I'm going to hit F12, shut down, restart. And trigger a good old-fashioned reboot once I get the password right. Hit F11 to confirm I want to restart. Okay, so what we can do here now is set up a little ping test. Okay, it's still responding to ping, but soon it's going to stop responding to ping. I'm going to open up an administrative command prompt, command line here, as administrator. And now it's time to edit my host file. Whoops. Notice ping stopped because obviously ESXi is rebooting there. Whoops. Those are the names I like to use. ESXi, vCenter, that's it. So now we can ping my name. Okay, so once this thing's up, if we point to that IP address with our browser, we should get a rather special page, including the client code to access ESXi with a full GUI. And the next step I do is I install the vCenter appliance. So I jump right in after I make sure ESXi is up. The very next thing I do is install the vCenter appliance and make sure that's working. But to get to that point, we have to make sure there's some local storage that's VMFS formatted, so the appliance has some place to install to. So when we get ESXi up, we'll want to look at the clock, we'll want to look at storage, and then we can install that vCenter appliance. Okay, my little ping tests are obviously working. I'm going to close those windows now. If I ping vCenter, that's the appliance that I'm going to be installing. Notice this is .51, so all that's good. And let's bring up a browser window. Okay. Support for Chrome is kind of odd in vSphere, so let's just go with good old-fashioned Internet Explorer. Let's see what happens. Continue this website. There we go. We're going to want to download the vSphere client. So right here it tells me the name of the code to download. There it is. Just slow. Okay, so we can go ahead and run it in our case. So yeah, that's never advisable. This is on a private network. I know I can trust this code, or we can do save in our downloads folder and then run it from there. Either way, the end result is a next install, where you go ahead and just let her rep. Okay, it's done with the download. .7-zip is what VMware uses to bundle this thing apparently. And now it's extracting to a temp folder and it's going to kick off the install of the vSphere client. So again, download vSphere client. You can see when I hover my mouse over it at the bottom, you can see what it's downloading. There's the name of the file. And it's pulling it from the web, not from 10.10.1.50. So scratch what I was saying about speed. It was interesting though, it was still a lot quicker after a reboot from the web. Okay, fine. We're done with the client download. We've got the code locally. Now we're going to just do a straightforward basic install here. That came up off screen. Let me bring that over to the middle. Next, next, agree, next, next. My solid state drive is my C drive. I'm going to want it on that. Next, install. So now we're installing the vSphere client. Considering it's an SSD, you'll see it still takes a bit of time. My download target was not an SSD, by the way, but where it's laying down the files to, the target is an SSD. So the vSphere client will start up rather quickly off of SSD storage. And this very first login, you can imagine, we're going to want to point to ESXi. Since it's in my host file, I can use name from here forward. And I don't have to type ESXi.local every time. Okay, finished. It's installed. Got this icon on the desk now. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. So root is the username, password is what we set during the install. ESXi is the host name rather than IP, that's preferred. It's going to log in for the first time, and we expect the certificate error. So I can say ignore from now on. I could also try to import the certificate. And we are in. Very first time on a brand new ESXi build. So it's kind of chapter 3 in my set of videos. 1, configure the BIOS. 2, install ESXi. 3, run the vSphere client to log in and begin some initial configuration. So I am on this build, which matches the version of ESXi. Obviously works with it, compatible with it. So what can we do here? Well, configuration would be a great start, and time. NTP is stopped. I don't like that. I want it to keep its clock in sync. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we'll notice the time here is wrong. And we've got the right time now, within a minute or so. We're going to want it to be an NTP client. And click Options, click Start. Actually, we got to set the NTP source first, so excuse me. We went to the second tab before doing anything. Click Add, and in my case, my ISP has one, so it's very close on the network. Low latency. It's a good choice. You'll want to pick time.nist.gov, or there's a lot of them, Windows time. You can set any NTP source. Restart NTP service to apply changes. Sure. Notice what it says at the bottom, that it's done its thing. Okay, so we got 2200 showing here, but we got the wrong time showing here. So let's think about that. So we go back in, click on Options, click on NTP Settings. So it is running. Start and stop with the host, with ESXi. I actually want an automatic, if any ports are open. I do believe I want to leave it on automatic. And now we are good. See how our clock jumped? So now let's go ahead and log back in. Launching vSphere client again. Did it again. Sorry. So when we log in, we want to see the proper time. So it's good to have time all squared away before we go ahead and do much more. Okay. So we get time sync working. And we now need a data store so that we can lay down the vCenter appliance I talked about. So let's go to ESXi host is showing on the left. Go to configuration. And let's go to storage. See what we got. All right, it's a little tight at 720 resolution to show you everything here, but it'll do. If we go to devices, we can see a list of what it's found. And the names are pretty informative, like Kingston SSD is pretty obvious here, and Samsung, and a 1 terabyte VMFS file system. That's a Western Digital drive. So I've got some drives that were already formatted and attached, and the DVD-ROM drive. Okay, Kingston, that's also that's got Windows on it. Notice it says NTFS, so that's a native boot of Windows on there. And VMFS on this other drive, that's a Samsung in this case. Okay, so that's a look at storage that it's seeing. What if we look at storage adapters? Well, things get interesting. We have HCI, fine. And we've got as media HCI. Notice a 1 terabyte's attached, it's fine, SATA 2 device. Local Slim, CD-ROM. Cougar Point, that's the Z68 chipset. And you'll see a Kingston and a Samsung attached. But let's scroll all the way to the bottom, and there we go. We've got a RAID array. So we have MegaRAID driver already initialized, and it can see a disk of some sort. And there we go, a 5 terabyte RAID 5 and an SSD that I formatted. So that sounds promising. So if we go to storage, we'll see we have a bunch of stuff it automatically found. This hasn't been added to my pool. They're already there. If, for instance, if I right-click and say Browse Data Store, this is already formatted and ready to roll. Okay? The thing is, you'll see inventory totally blank over here. So if you're like me, where you already have some virtual machines configured on the storage that's visible, we can go ahead and add them to inventory. Now my appliance got hosed, and I'm going to go ahead and delete the one that's there. Oops. The reason I'm doing this is because it's broken. And if there's to keep the file system clean and to install right on a nice speedy SSD that's on my LSI RAID controller, I want to free up some space, and I want to use that same name, the VSI, the appliance. Okay, so that's the basics. We configure some storage. If we clicked on Add Storage, say, and it found a new device on a SAN or LAN, like for instance this Kingston that has NTFS on it, we can reformat it. So it has NTFS in there, but I can reformat it VMFS and then go ahead and lay down, VMware's files. Next, boom, it's now ready as a data store. So in my case, I already have some data stores available, ready for the next step, which is probably to go ahead and install the vSphere client. Now, I'm just going to finish looking at things here. We did time. We see it's running. We didn't look at DNS. And notice it's pointing to, a little slow, local for domain, DNS. Okay, so all my settings stuck from the initial install. That's excellent. And if we had an SSD, you could point to host cache and configure that. And pass-through is configured here. Okay, so lots to do, but really I just want to get in the routine of logging in under vCenter, excuse me. So instead of logging into the ESXi host, I want full feature and cloning and all that good stuff that you get only if you have the vCenter appliance. So here we go. We're going to do deploy OVF template. And I've already got the file downloaded. No, actually the network share is not available. So let's do this from scratch. We're going to want to get the files we need for the vCenter appliance. Yes, so we got it right. We have a small text file. We have a download that's underway with 41 minutes left. Deploy from template. If we look here, you'll see a lot of people talking about walking you through configuring this. So notice they're talking about the same 3 files. And we're going to deploy from this template, and then it's going to ask us some questions. Okay. That's one walkthrough guide. This one is even more detailed. Click on File, Deploy OVF Template. Let's do that. File, Deploy OVF Template. Let's paste that into our clipboard, our path. Let's browse our way to it. Whoops, still not there. There we go. Point to the OVF file. Notice it's looking for packages of the right type. Now that we pointed to that file, we should be able to click Next, and it tells us details about it. It tells us the size, what it is. It's actually SLES 11, SUSE Linux Enterprise. Click Next. Although I like to put hostname first whenever possible, so that's my hostname, and then there's the full name of it. Click Next. Okay. I'd like to put it on something fast, so I'm going to put it on the LSI controller's attached SSD drive, which has enough space apparently because it hasn't complained. 89 available. Thick provision, we'll just leave it at default. Hit Next. And notice down here in the instructions, that's basically what it tells us to. Next, 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 finish. So let's do that. Okay, you'll see it's doing its thing. So now it's got to move this large file from my local file system into the ESXi host data store. So what it's really doing is moving from my laptop, doing a gigabit file transfer upload, and that's going to take some time because it's 4 gig in size. So I'll resume this video when that file is finished being shoved up onto the SSD, and at that point we're ready to go ahead and boot and configure this appliance. Let's position ourselves here where we can read the manual to do that. And you'll see we're going to power it on, and then we're going to point our browser to the IP address of it with that port number 5480. And log in. I found some issues with time and so forth, so might be some tweaks needed to these directions, but for the most part they're quite good. We already just talked about, already noticed that we only need 3 files. This cert and MF file are not necessary, and they're not even present on the download site anymore. Okay, so we'll pick up there when this download is, when this upload is done. Now I'm watching my network traffic. It's slowed. It's stopped. There we go. It's pulling over the second file. Network I/O is gone to nothing. So not sure what it's doing at this point. Some sort of configuration step. But it is not doing a file transfer anymore. That much I can say from looking at a network monitor I have running here. So when this is done, we should see it show up in inventory. So notice there's a little plus next to ESXi. Let me go ahead and click that plus. There you go. So the virtual machine is there. Click on Summary. Does it have properties? Yes, it does. But we're not quite through with that last 1%. It's normal for it to say VMware Tools is not running when you don't have it booted. I'll also say, let's see if I have the guide here up. I don't have it up, but it's good for up to 50, let's see, I think a dozen hosts and 50 virtual machines, which is fine for our purposes. Again, this appliance is really meant to be a simple, quick way to get started with vCenter without having to worry about a SQL Server or Oracle database configuration and the complexity of installing a whole other operating system like Windows 2008 just for vCenter. So it's an all-in-one appliance that doesn't claim to be perfect for production, but for a lab it's perfectly, or almost perfectly well suited. The minor things that are missing compared to its Windows counterpart, the full vCenter, are just not important in a lab environment. Okay, apparently this last 4 seconds kind of takes forever. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video until it's done doing whatever it's doing. Alright, you can see it, it did take a while. It's a 11-minute proposition from start to finish. And it's done, so it's completed. The thing I've noticed though is it gives a crazy amount of RAM. So notice what it says. It's appropriate for 5 hosts and 50 virtual machines. I've never seen it come anywhere near using the 8 gig. Okay, I've got the vCenter appliance uploaded. This is actually my second attempt here. Anyhow, so the vCenter appliance is there. And it's got a bunch of settings, like 8 gig of RAM, which is excessive, 2 CPUs, also excessive. But I'll deal with that later. Let me go ahead and open a console, and let's watch that thing boot for the first time. It's on a solid-state drive, so it should boot awfully fast. There it goes. Now to configure it that first time, we're going to want to bring up our browser and point to the IP address that it's given. And we're going to also want those handy instructions for initial configuration, which I've got right here. It's going to get a little confusing. Sorry, bear with me while I set things up here. Okay, that was fast. So, because there's some issues with the database and time, I found it best to go ahead and configure the network and set the time zone right up front and reboot it. So I'm going to do that. Okay, that's done. So we've configured our network and we've hard-coded instead of DHCP. Let's do the time zone next. Americas, United States, number 1 is New York. It scrolled at the top. You couldn't see it, but it is. And say yes, and that is the time. Alright, so now we've got things configured like that. And now if we go by the book with the instructions here, it doesn't actually talk about time. Right? So it says, let's look at database. It's just stopped, and then we can configure DNS and look at that. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to point to this host. Let me use Internet Explorer. Why not? And how did I know that? Again, if you bring up the console, it tells us that. 10.10.1.51, in my case, it was in the cache. We want to continue that website, log in as root, VMware is the initial password, and we're in. Just like it's said in the instructions, it should say service stopped and database not configured. Excellent. It now says check on network and look around. So let's do that. Services, excuse me, network. That looks good. Address static. Interesting how it put Google there next. All right, that's fine. Yeah, it bothers me a little because ESXi I don't have configured that. So let me just see if it'll save that twice. It did. Okay, now we're going to go to Update, Settings. Excuse me, where is it? System, Reboot. There it is. So I'm going to trigger a reboot. So we've made numerous changes. And now we're going to watch the console reboot. Notice the clock looks good. Looks correct. So the time zone's correct. It's using the clock and the BIOS. That's it. Everything's matching. Now we'll just let it go ahead and boot. And then we'll do the database configuration stuff it talks about here. So DNS, network configured, authentication, we don't need. I'm not doing NIS or Active Directory. We're just going to jump right into the database, but this part you have to be very careful. As I learned the hard way, if you do it out of order, you kind of host things. So it wants us to configure database by clicking on Test Settings. This will take a while, and then when it's done, click Save Settings. Database will complete. We reboot the virtual machine, and it's saying on the next boot, it should start the VPXD daemon initialized database, eventually being ready to use. I don't remember that coming up. We'll watch it carefully this time. All right, so we're back. We're in, and it's telling us to click Database, and let's use the embedded DB2. Right here, embedded. Doesn't actually say DB2, just embedded is what it says. And then it says just click on test. And that does take a while, just like it says. Well, not that long. Okay, and what does it say to do after test? Takes a while. Once done, click Save Settings. Notice at the top it says any change in database configuration requires a stop-start of vCenter server to take effect. You'll notice this takes longer. And up here, what it's telling us to do after this, when it's completed the configuration, we're going to click on System and Reboot. And then we're going to watch it carefully at boot time to see if VPXD starts. And then it tells us just log in with the client. So that's the setup instructions, if all goes well. Client just looks like this, just sitting there. You're not going to see any activity from there anymore. take a quick look at how it looks from an ESX perspective. So if we look at performance, very little. If we look at disk, yeah, little. How about resources? What's consumed? Well, not much, although we are up to 1.5 gig of RAM used out of the 8 gig allocated. So once I have, I don't know, a dozen virtual machines, and I feel I'm kind of where I need to be, if this thing still shows 8 gig of RAM and I'm only using like less than 2 gig, I'll probably cut that amount of memory I'm giving this virtual machine down a bit. And I probably won't, well, not really necessary, but, and I probably won't notice much difference, but I want plenty of free memory for my VMs, not so much for vCenter. Operation successful. That's good. So now let's follow the directions. It says click System and then Reboot. All right. I can't resist, though, clicking on vCenter server first just to see status. It still shows stopped. Okay. So now we click System, click Reboot, let her reboot. Here's how it looks rebooting. So for speed and responsiveness, since I log into the vCenter user interface frequently for doing any kind of ESX sysadmin, it's really nice to have it running on solid-state drive. And I'll want to clone or do something with this from time to time as a backup. Okay, that was fast, I would say. So let's log in there. It took care of it before us. Really nice. Now notice it says stopped, and it certainly didn't start the database automatically like this seemed to say it would. So let's look around a little bit. Database. Settings. Bunch of settings, fine. Inventory small, less than 100 hosts. Okay, you can crank up the RAM if you have a large inventory. Not even close for me. Change the password, excellent. You can save log files elsewhere, good idea. Just looking at all the settings here. Time zone is New York, good. This an active directory blank because I never touched it. So notice this. That's all kind of interesting. All right, well, there seems to be no auto start button. So let's just go ahead and start vCenter. And here's what it says. End user license agreement not done. Okay, I logged in from Chrome and the EULA tab shows up fine now. So a little strange, but you'll notice we're logged in the same machine. And next to status, there's the EULA tab. So now that we've accepted the EULA, we'll be able to move on. I guess that finished. So let's minimize that one. So back to Internet Explorer. Let's see what happens. The EULA tab is missing next to status. So this hopefully does mean it's not going to complain this time when I try to start vCenter. Acting a little sluggish there, but we're in. Okay, now let's try starting vCenter. So what's left? Well, we're hoping this starts successfully. And then we need to deal with making sure it auto starts. Indeed, it started successfully. Excellent. In hindsight, if I had used Google Chrome or probably Firefox, I would have had that end user license agreement to sign. So that was a little bit weird, but okay. The other thing we don't know is it going to auto start? So if we reboot, is the database going to be running? I don't know, but let's give it a try. So we're going to close the client, and we're going to restart the vSphere client, and let's now log into vCenter. Install the certificate and ignore errors from here on forward. Looking good. So we're in, and it says our host name, vCenter. Not vCenter .local or any of that. Okay. I'm not going to configure it at all yet. Let me just do what I said I was going to do, and that is a reboot. So it's under System, Reboot, Reboot, and let's let it reboot. Okay, we know it takes only about 2 minutes to reboot. Not even, because again, SSD. Let's log back in locally so we can see what's going on. Meaning so we can see the console of that vCenter as it reboots. And here's what the console is doing. So not responding to ping at this point because it's down and coming back up again. We want to see if that database auto starts. Waiting for embedded DB2 database to start up. So that is very promising. Success. Starting VMware VPXD. Success. Everything's looking good. So what's the other thing to test? Well, what about when ESXi reboots? We also want to see that this vCenter appliance, if I have forgotten to restart it or, shut it down gracefully through the web UI, I don't really want to have to worry about that. I want to just see that ESXi auto starts it, just handles it. Okay, so that's up. So yeah, we'll deal with auto start. And the thing is, we haven't really tested this yet. So here's the vSphere client. We know the clock is good. I'm a stickler for getting time right before I spend too much time on here. Excellent. But let's log into vCenter and see if its clock looks good as well. So we're kind of done logging in with the web UI. We don't need it anymore. The database auto starts. We are in good shape. Notice the login's pretty quick. That's a good sign. Now, let's create a data center. Let's call it data center. And look at the time. Perfect. Our clock is right. So our clocks are synced. I wish I knew a way to make vCenter have an NTP client and keep its clock perfect. I haven't really thought about that yet. I also want a way to add the ESXi host by name. So I do if we hack the host file. So watch what happens. If we go right-click, add a host, and we say ESXi, it's going to fail miserably because there's no true DNS. So let's fix that. We're going to run WinSCP, and we'll go ahead and log into this vCenter server for the very first time since it was created. We'll go into the etc folder. We'll go into the host file, and we'll right-click it. So let's bring up WinSCP, one instance there, and we'll want another WinSCP to edit the host file on ESX itself, ESXi. Excellent. Hosts. So, right-click edit, nice and easy, way easier than Nano or VI or something, especially if you don't know those. So we got two host files, one from vCenter, one from ESXi. Make sure there's no trailing spaces, a carriage return, close that. So now we've edited host file over there on the vCenter side. Let's see how the host file looks here on the ESXi side. And it still has the .local because that's how we configured. So I didn't mess with its line. And vCenter.local. We didn't call it .local, I don't believe. That was my mistake. Okay, so now we've patched up the two host files. Okay, and now let's try to add the host back in. But this time just with the simple name of ESXi. And it didn't put .local at the end, so that's promising. Let it finish. And then we're going to add something to inventory and then see if we can open a console to it. Now let's see if we can open a console without that goofy error. Much better. Okay. Excellent responsiveness. Things are looking excellent. I made one misstep. So in that last half-hour video, yeah, I messed up a host file. So let's just take a moment to review what the host file should look like. If it looks like this, it's going to work. So on the ESXi side, don't mess with the line it configures for you. Go ahead and put in vCenter without anything after it. And on the vCenter side, put in ESXi without the .local. That seems to be the recipe for a nice working lab without any goofy errors. And the ability to vMotion and move things around, or clone in this case. And kick off a test clone. Let's say we do Windows 7 clone. That'll be actually my host. Yeah, let's just do. So we kick off a clone. We also know that's using vSphere. VMware vCenter server appliance functionality. So if we go ahead and clone in the same source to this disk that has 1 terabyte left, it's not complaining, all right? It's kicked off a clone, and snapshotting is working because the virtual machine is actually running, right? And now it's copying the virtual machine files from one spot to the next. So cloning is also working. Think of this as storage vMotion, really. It's could have also done a migrate, right? That probably would have been a little slicker, not taking up extra space. So if we do right-click migrate, we could actually move vCenter itself to a different data store while it's running. So that's just the usual magic of VMware. Okay, so that's a wrap. I met the objectives of showing how to configure the BIOS Then how to install ESXi 5.0 up, roll-up 1. Then how to configure ESXi, including time and host file and networking. Then how to install vCenter server appliance and configure it as well in time and networking. And then finally, how to log in using the vSphere client to this new vCenter appliance and add a data center and a host to inventory and then a few virtual machines, which we're then able to manipulate, copy, and do things with. So I've met the kind of 4 chapters I had in my head. I think it's probably going to be about an hour-and-a-half video total. If you watch them all in sequence, you should be able to get through creating your own lab using these same steps, particularly if they have the same exact hardware. It will be identical. That's about it. Configuring RAID arrays is really separate. Everyone's going to have their own preference, RAID 0, RAID 5, and that is a step I didn't actually show. My RAID was already configured. That can really be split off into a second video because it depends on what RAID adapter you buy, and it looks wildly different. So in my kind of soup to nuts tutorial here, I did not cover the RAID configuration because again, I suspect different RAID adapters can be out there and it doesn't really apply to everyone watching the video set. So I'll go ahead and create a new RAID configuration demo at some point, a video. Okay, thank you for getting through this series of videos, and hopefully you found it helpful. And thank you for visiting tinkertree.com. And I'll just point out politely, if you got this far in the video, you're probably a pretty hardcore fan. If you're thinking of buying the same hardware, if you could possibly go to tinkertree.com/vzilla. Say you're buying a 2600 Core i7 CPU or motherboard, any part you buy from there, there's affiliate links or skim links that help Tinkertree website operate. So this is kind of my first ad ever, pointing out that it would be really helpful if I could at least cover my costs, given I donated so much of my time to the website. So again, thank you for visiting tinkertree.com. Your feedback is always welcome at the end of all my posts. It's always great to see what people think, good and bad. Okay, thank you. So something I need to mention here is if we take the vSphere client and log it straight into the ESXi host, we can open the console here to the vCenter appliance and see it running. Now I want to be able to reboot ESXi and have a graceful shutdown of this appliance. So what we want to do is click ESXi, click on Configuration, click on Virtual Machine Startup. First step, click Properties, and allow this stuff, these features. And then move vCenter up into Automatic Startup. And then finally click Edit and change this. I don't need to wait 2 full minutes after booting. I can wait, say, 15 seconds. And if some other VM is there and tools is started, it's pretty much done, so turn that on, sure. And for shutdown, on a solid state, 60 seconds is more than enough, but let me give it 90. Okay. Now let's watch what happens. That's done. Let's set up a little ping test. Okay, so we're pinging. We're going to go ahead and take this console, make it so you can see it. And you should see evidence of a graceful shutdown where SLES 11 is being gracefully shut down, so we're not corrupting the file system or database. So right-click and reboot ESX itself. That's good. So we see a sign it's shutting down gracefully. No web login to the vCenter needed to shut down that way. We just let ESXi handle telling the vCenter appliance to shut down. So this is really kind of this really is a required step before considering this lab kind of production. When I get all this working then and I'm happy and the database is not corrupt, I'll go ahead and clone this so I have a second copy of vCenter, and I'll go ahead and license it because now I'm ready and I'm done with creating this lab. So if I have a license that'll let me last longer than a few days, that's a good time to do it after you make sure you're comfortable. So did you see that? It said clean, killed cleanly. It's all done. So it's gracefully shut down. It stops responding to ping. ESXi is going to stop responding to ping here soon too now. So that's what rebooting looks like in there. ESXi is now down. So 90 seconds was more than enough for the graceful shutdown, and now ESXi itself is rebooting. And what we'll also see is after my BIOS and my RAID array comes up, in about a minute it'll start responding to ping. And what we'll also witness is that vCenter will automatically start. So that's the slick part of this, that it's a full test of graceful shutdown and reboot. Even better would be an automatic shutdown of ESXi should my battery be triggered. A power out goes out in my house. That means my battery knows it's on UPS instead of line power, and it could tell ESXi to reboot, which would in turn tell all the virtual machines to gracefully shut down. So those are some of my next setup steps I have planned for the future. But for now, this will do. Yeah, I'll leave the video recording. I just want you to see that auto start of the VM is going to work. The vCenter VM. Just to recap the kind of chapters, we configured the BIOS from the ASRock motherboard. We then, in the boot order and so forth, stuck in the DVD. We installed ESXi on a USB stick, and that was the roll-up 1 version of ESXi 5.0. We then configured ESXi, including its time syncing and its clock, and its a little bit of storage, and its host name, networking, and hard-coded its IP. We then downloaded and configured the vCenter appliance and did the same thing, making sure its clock is right. You can see ESXi is coming back up now. Once we had vCenter added, we tested it and found a little mistake, and I fixed that with a .local issue there. So we had vCenter and ESXi seeing each other and able to clone, and the lab was almost done, but I also wanted to make sure everyone's clocks were auto-syncing, and then finally I wanted to make sure that the vCenter database wouldn't be corrupt when I reboot ESX and just automatically handle the vCenter virtual machine gracefully shutting down. And now it's responding to ping. So this went well, and that means we should be able to soon be able to log in here. Now vCenter takes a little longer than that to boot, so even though it's responding to ping, the network stack is up, the database isn't yet initialized. Got to wait a little longer than that. Let's try again. So because the database is on solid state, I'm giving myself a shot at pretty good speed though at this thing coming up. So when this thing logs in, I believe that'll really conclude all I set out to show in these series of initial configuration videos. Didn't really cover networking. That might be kind of one of the optional things, like UPS battery shutdown automation, configuring a second network adapter. All of that's really icing on the cake, and it's after the initial configuration, not really part of the core base configuration. Okay, vCenter is up. We're logging in, and there we go. So that went well. Auto start and auto stop working. Okay. Hopefully you found this series of videos helpful. If you end up buying any of these parts, one way to show your support without any cost to you, just a little bit of time, would be to visit tinkertree.com/vzilla, and any links you click there are affiliate links that help cover the cost of running tinkertree.com. So again, if you're thinking of buying something from Newegg or Amazon, those parts are in the list over on tinkertree.com/vzilla. Consider clicking those links so that those web vendors know that the source came from me. And I thank you for watching this video, and if you actually got to the end of this last video or chapter 4, that's impressive. Please do take a moment to give your feedback with the comments right below the web post. Okay, thank you. Bye now. All right, in this video I'm going to show kind of the cheap way, the free way, to back up vCenter server appliance. So here we have the vCenter appliance running, and we can leave it running. I'm actually logged in through it. The nifty thing is we can clone it, we can migrate it, we can back it up while it's running. In this case, I've got vCenter working. Its database is not corrupt. It's functioning fine on an SSD right now. And let's see how it looks. Thick provisioned, thick provisioned. So it's using up the full amount of space. It doesn't have to grow and shrink. It's on SSD. I don't think it matters much, but to back it up, I kind of like this concept. We do template, clone to template. So that'll kind of clone it to a master copy. And let me get the name in the clipboard. You might remember the file system only holds up to this long for the folder name. When I put the word vCenter on there, it cut off the word appliance. So let's clone to a template and give it that name. And on the file system, that's exactly how it'll show, and it'll be a template. And to keep it trim on how much space it uses, we'll do thin provisioning. And in my case, I'm trying to offload stuff. I'm actually putting on an external RAID array to free up space on my internal RAID array for some reswizzling I'm doing. But anyhow, put it on some data store or another that you prefer that has plenty of space. And click Next, and now you'll see it's going to thin provision this. It's going to use up less space, and it's going to sit there in that template format. Now at the bottom, you'll see what it's doing. It created a snapshot, which was very brief, and now it's copying a bunch of virtual machine files. And why are we not seeing it here? Well, it's because we're in host and clusters mode. What if we turn on VMs and templates, and now look at the list? Now you can see that, oops, that's an old template I had, but we're also going to see the new template that's being created in that view. All right, so that's a view of creating backup using templates. Let's look at the underlying file system for a second here and look at this external RAID array I'm copying to and browse the data store. And you'll see it laid down a folder with exactly the folder name I was talking about. And in it, there's a template that it's beginning to clone into. This VMDK file hasn't grown yet. And there's 2 hard drives it's going to be copying. I have a lot of work going on right now, so it's going to take a while. So that's it. That's the process to create kind of a master backup if I ever needed to rewind in time to when my vCenter server was perfectly deployed and had no issues and no corruption or anything. This is my easy way to do it. I'd right-click on the template and say deploy from template, and it'll then make a new copy from the template that's read-writable, and I can pick any name I want, and now I've got a new vCenter server at some later date without having to go through any of that setup I already did. One other thing to keep in mind is licensing. So I haven't actually put a license in this yet. So when you deploy from template, it's probably best to just go ahead and deploy from template and then license the vCenter server or attach your license to it. But license files can be moved around pretty easily. It doesn't really matter that much. It's not quite like Windows activation. Okay, thank you for watching.